Friends, hold tight, because the story we're about to tell is one of history's most striking transformations. We turn our eyes to the year 1978. China, exhausted from decades of revolution, starvation, and chaos, the Cultural Revolution, was struggling to breathe. It was at this very moment that a man, 74 years old, physically small but possessing a colossal vision, stepped onto the stage, Deng Xiaoping. Deng's demeanor was so fundamentally different from Mao Zedong, who had ruled the country with an iron fist for years. Unlike Mao's personality cult, Deng was more outspoken, more fatherly, and incredibly pragmatic. He had one firm belief: the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, was the only vehicle that could lead the Chinese people to prosperity. But this required major surgery. The country was riddled with deep wounds from Mao's ideological experiments. Deng's call for ideological liberation and the wind of democracy. Deng rolled up his sleeves for this massive transformation. Alongside him were the most important figures of the reformist wing within the party, famously known as his right and left hands, Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. This trio announced the magic formula that would get the country back on its feet, the 4 modernizations. What did this mean? It meant rapidly bringing agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology up to modern standards. Simply put, it meant transforming China into a modern state. Initially, Deng created such an atmosphere that people thought, "We are freer now." This was the wind of ideological liberation. Activists flocked to Beijing's Zidan Street, putting up giant big character posters. The street became known as the Democracy Wall, the place where people expressed their grievances and ideas. Most posters criticized the deceased Mao and his legacy, especially the Gang of Four. Deng initially tolerated these criticisms. He told an American journalist, "People have complaints, and they should be allowed to express them." This was truly a massive change. However, this openness was to have a limit. That boundary was drawn in December 1978 by Wei Jingsheng, an electrician and former Red Guard. Wei took a brave step and published an essay titled "The Fifth Modernization," signed with his full name and address. According to him, for the 4 modernizations to work, democracy, which was indispensable for the well-being of the Chinese people, must be added. Wei wrote, "Our sole objective in realizing modernization is democracy, liberty, and happiness for all." What was the result? Wei and about 30 other activists were quickly arrested and given long prison sentences. The wind of openness was replaced by the party's iron discipline. In March 1979, Deng declared the fundamental rule of the reforms, the 4 cardinal principles. These principles eliminated any remaining doubt. The party would never go. They mandated the upholding of the socialist road, the dictatorship of the proletariat, the leadership of the Communist Party, and Marxism-Leninism Mao Zedong thought. The reforms were great, but they would only proceed under the control of the Communist Party. Capitalism with Chinese characteristics, to get rich is glorious. While keeping a tight rein on politics, Deng shifted into high gear for economic breakthroughs. His historic trip to the U.S., the first by a Chinese leader since 1943, was Deng's message to the world: we want to trade. His enjoyment of American traditions, like wearing a cowboy hat in Texas, highlighted his pragmatism and the new, outward-looking face of China. Deng's vision was simple: lift millions out of poverty and into the middle class. The vehicle was socialism with Chinese characteristics. In practice, this meant taking the dynamism of market capitalism and using it under strict state control. Decisions were decentralized, private enterprise was permitted, and even price controls were relaxed. But remember, the strings were still firmly held by the party. Special Economic Zones, SEZs, shine. The first shining stars of China's economic miracle were the Special Economic Zones, SEZs. Inspired by the Asian tigers like Singapore and South Korea, these zones were established to attract foreign investment. Shenzhen, just 24 kilometers from Hong Kong, and Xiamen, facing Taiwan, were among the first examples. They offered foreign investors access to cheap labor and raw materials, with less bureaucracy and lower tax advantages. They were dubbed the doors to China, The SEZs achieved incredible success, attracting massive amounts of foreign capital, new factories, and employment. Rural Revolution. A revolution also took place in the countryside. The specter of Mao's collective farming was banished. Rural households were allocated their own land with greater freedom on how to cultivate it. Within 6 years, 97% of peasant households transitioned to individual ownership. The result? Agricultural production increased by over 60%. Starvation and famine, the nightmare of Chinese peasants for millennia, suddenly became a thing of the past. Furthermore, thousands of intellectuals, students, and officials exiled during the Cultural Revolution were allowed to return to cities and resume their posts. University entrance exams were reinstated in 1977, and academic life was revived across the country. Military modernization and population control. Abroad, China maintained its influence as a major regional power. However, a costly, limited war launched against Communist Vietnam in 1979, the Sino-Vietnamese War, painfully exposed the weaknesses of the People's Liberation Army, PLA. This setback prompted Deng to initiate a comprehensive overhaul and modernization of the armed forces. Simultaneously, there was a huge problem at home: population. Thanks to major advancements in public health, China's population had nearly doubled in 30 years, reaching almost 1 billion. This rate was unsustainable. That's why, in 1980, China implemented the one-child policy, history's most stringent social engineering experiment. For most families, a second child meant heavy fines and sanctions. In some cases, forced abortions and sterilizations occurred. This policy naturally created a generation of single-child families with a strong gender imbalance in favor of males. Tiananmen. The hope for democracy is tested by blood. As economic reforms advanced, many believed political change was also inevitable. This hope was fueled by Yaobang, Deng's former ally, and the party's new general secretary. Hu was unusually outspoken and open-minded, even challenging the privileges of the princelings, the children of high-ranking CCP officials. The public loved him, and many reformers hoped he would eventually succeed Deng. But the party's tolerance was limited. In 1986, student protests erupted across China, calling for greater openness and democracy. When Deng Xiaoping ordered Hu to disperse these protests, Hu refused. The price was high. Hu was forced to resign and make a humiliating self-criticism. 2 years later, he died of a heart attack during a Politburo meeting. Mourning turns to protest. The unjust treatment and death of such a popular leader by a party perceived as out of touch sparked massive public outcry. Thousands of mourners, just as after Zhou Enlai's death, streamed to Tiananmen Square, turning their grief into protest. Exactly 70 years after the iconic 1919 student protests, 100,000 students demonstrated in the square, chanting for Mr. Democracy. On May 13th, hundreds began a hunger strike, hoping to force the government into negotiations. The new party general secretary Zhao Ziyang, a reformist protege of Deng, visited the protesters on May 19th, expressing concern and sympathy. However, Premier Li Peng was a much more conservative and hardline figure. Li secured Deng's support for an uncompromising response to the protests. The June 4th Massacre. There would be no negotiation. Martial law was declared. And on the night of June 3rd, soldiers and tanks were sent to clear Tiananmen Square by any means necessary. The result was a massacre. While official figures reported hundreds of civilian deaths, many believe the true death toll was much higher. Following this bloody incident, the world witnessed an unforgettable moment of defiance. A solitary, unidentified man blocking a convoy of tanks on Chang'an Avenue. Known as the Tank Man, this figure became a global symbol of resistance against authoritarianism. Consequences: international media condemned the massacre, and the US and EU imposed sanctions. Deng Xiaoping denounced the protests as a counter-revolutionary riot. Zhao Ziyang, who met with the students, was dismissed and held under house arrest for 15 years. Deng Xiaoping officially retired from frontline politics later that year, appearing to hand power back to the conservative wing. The reform era seemed stalled, and China was isolated once more. The dragon awakens again. The second economic drive. In the aftermath of the Tiananmen incident, foreign investment had ground to a halt, and economic forecasts were lowered. But Deng Xiaoping would not allow China to sink into economic stagnation. The Southern Tour and the Declaration of the Market Economy. In 1992, at the age of 87, Deng once again took center stage. He embarked on his famous Southern Tour, visiting the successful special economic zones. In this tour, he demanded bolder leadership and more energy for reform. He explicitly rejected the old dogma that a socialist state must have a planned economy. Deng, with his immense personal authority, single-handedly put reform back at the center of the agenda. A new social contract was being written between the CCP and the people. The party would give you growth, prosperity, and national rejuvenation, and in return you would accept the party's legitimacy. The 1992 Party Congress officially declared China a socialist market economy. From then on, markets, not the state, would determine the prices of goods, services, labor, and capital. Many state-owned enterprises, SOEs, were restructured, privatized, or allowed to fail. History's greatest economic miracle. These moves sparked an incredible boom. GDP surged from 3.9% in 1990 to 14.2% in 1992 and remained high for a decade. Here's the most striking figure. According to World Bank data, in 1990, over 80% of China's population was living in extreme poverty. Over the next 3 decades, this number dropped to 0%. This is regarded as one of history's greatest economic miracles, lifting so many people out of poverty in record time. However, this boom also had a cost. Government subsidies for housing and food were removed, and price controls were loosened. Parts of the population felt abandoned. Unemployment, corruption, pollution, and especially inequality between the urban and rural populations grew rapidly. Tens of millions of the rural poor flocked to developing cities, but the hukou system, strict residency requirements, often relegated them to second-class citizen status, deprived of state benefits. Global superpower and the digital wall. Deng Xiaoping died in 1997 at the age of 92. His legacy was controversial: a great statesman who rescued China from poverty, or a leader who used economic success to cement one-party rule. His successor, the paramount leader, Jiang Zemin, took over. Although conservative, Jiang continued the reforms, balancing a growing economy with a highly centralized state. End of the century of humiliation. Internationally, China gained confidence. In July 1997, Hong Kong was peacefully handed over from the United Kingdom to the People's Republic of China after 156 years of colonial rule. 2 years later, Macau was returned. These events definitively marked the end of China's century of humiliation. Both territories were promised limited autonomy under the one country, two systems formula. Global trade giant. The outside world assumed that prosperous China would inevitably demand political rights and become more like the West. U.S. President Bill Clinton warned China that its human rights record was putting it on the wrong side of history. Yet, contrary to these expectations, China continued to grow in economic power in the 21st century. But the Communist Party's power remained almost unchallenged. China's entry into the World Trade Organization, WTO, in 2001 was a turning point. Chinese goods became cheaper and more competitive globally. Foreign companies increasingly moved production offshore to China to benefit from cheap labor. Within a few years, China became the world's largest exporter. Its economy grew at record rates of 10%, 12%, even 14%. The World Bank described this as the fastest sustained growth of a major economy in history. The only thing keeping pace with this incredible speed was the country's carbon emissions and air pollutants. The surveillance state. Hosting its first Olympic Games in 2008 was the perfect stage for China to showcase its prosperous, confident, and ambitious new face to the world. In 2009, China surpassed Japan to become the world's second-largest economy, but this success came at a cost: freedoms. The CCP's authority was not entirely undisputed. Protests against the perceived injustices of the administration in regions like Tibet and Xinjiang were met with force and mass detentions. A sophisticated system of surveillance and strict censorship was installed across the country. The Great Firewall helped protect Chinese citizens from harmful foreign ideas, while the internet was constantly patrolled for any sign of dissent. In 2012, the cautious technocrat Hu Jintao handed the flag to a new leader, Xi Jinping. In conclusion, a century after the last Qing emperor was deposed, China was a completely transformed nation. The path was long, bloody, and tumultuous, but there is no doubt that the Middle Kingdom had reclaimed its natural place at the heart of global affairs. Our story ends here, but China's ascent continues.